What's going on, guys? Thanks for checking out another video. So today we're going to talk about when, where, and how to fish Ned rigs in saltwater for redfish, speckled trout, and flounder. Stay tuned.
Hit it. Nice fish.
So just like many of the baits that we're accustomed to using here on an everyday basis in saltwater, we have actually gotten those from the bass fishing guys, from the freshwater world. They seem to be pushing the envelope further and further, creating new baits, changing things up, and not becoming stagnant like oftentimes in saltwater we do. We find something that kind of works and we stick with it, and we really don't adventure out and try much other stuff. So the Ned rig has become, a key factor of my fishing arsenal, key piece of tackle that I always have on the boat through the summer all the way through the winter. But we are in the winter months right now, and that is when the Ned rig really shines. A lot of times fish can be cold, they can be heavily pressured. In the saltwater, a lot of times the colder the water, the more the fish school up, the easier they are to find, and in return, the more they get fished, the more they get pressured, the more they get educated. So usually downsizing and finesse fishing can really help. It can draw bites from fish that wouldn't eat, and big fish oftentimes will eat little small baits. So there's honestly thousands of different soft plastics that are made for Ned heads and technically a Ned rig bait. But I'm just going to go over 4 of my favorite, and I'm going to go over a couple different styles of Ned head, and also show y'all my favorite Ned head for saltwater fishing. I've got them here, and we're going to kind of go through them. I'm not going to get too much into color. Color is really, it's not going to change much from your generic soft plastics and what you're already using. But downsizing can just be so crucial in getting bites. Just the other day, I was on a school of redfish, and we were having trouble getting them to eat a full-size diesel minnow, and even some smaller paddle tails. And I had my Ned rigs on the boat, and I was like, well, let's try them on. So we put the Ned rigs on 2 different rods and kind of tested them against each other. And that smaller profile, the more subtle movements really seem to work well. One thing before we get into going over these actual baits and showing you what I like to fish, I want to share with kind of what comes into play as you fish a smaller bait. So for me in saltwater, and this isn't always true for every single application, but I'd say for 99% of the times, this is how it works for me. The smaller my bait, the slower I fish it. Because when it's smaller, it's got less presence in the water, which means you've got to slow it down so that those fish find it. We already need to slow down in these colder months while we're fishing. Let these fish have time to move to the bait and realize that they want to eat it, realize it's something to eat. But slowing a smaller bait down and keeping it in that zone longer is going to give it more of a chance to find that fish. That's what I call finesse fishing in saltwater, is slowing it down, not necessarily always going to a smaller bait, but just working your way into the strike zone slower and more subtly is really what finesse fishing boils down to for me in saltwater. One big thing that I share on the podcast a lot, and I share in a lot of YouTube videos, is you really want to let these fish feel like they've found the bait. The colder the water, the spookier the fish, the more so you've got to allow them to feel as if they have just discovered this bait. If you force a bait in there, if you reel it too fast, if you land it in the middle of a school of fish, they're going to spook. I don't care if it's 5 feet of water sometimes. For speckled trout this time of year when it's cold, those fish spook very easily. So having that finesse presentation, no matter what kind of bait you're using, is key, and letting it sit in that strike zone, little subtle movements, little wiggles, is really what gets it done. And that's why these Ned rigs, which stand straight up, are so key. So I'm going to go ahead and show y'all, and I'll do some zoomed in stuff with my handheld camera afterwards. But the cool thing about Ned heads is they want to generally stand up like this. Now you're going to find some plastics that the Ned heads don't want to stand up as well, and you'll just kind of have to play around with that. But with the way that a lot of the eyes on these hooks are set, they're off to the side of this head, so they're going to stand like this. And when you pull it, it's going to kick up like this and then drop back down on its head. So it looks like a little crab or a little shrimp or a little bait fish, whatever kind of soft plastic you add to these heads. It looks like one of those just kind of milling around on the bottom and digging around on the bottom, makes some little small puffs of sand and mud, and it's just a really effective way to fish. So first off, I'm going to go through these couple different types of jig heads, or Ned heads, if you will, that I like to fish. Then I'm going to show you the soft plastics. Your generic non-weedless Ned head, this is by, I believe, ZMAN. I've got a couple. They all look pretty similar. It's just going to be like this little mushroom head and a little short hook. These little short hooks are, made for these smaller baits, the smaller profile baits that are made for these Ned rigs. The original, I believe the original bait was just a little TRD, which is like a Cinco worm, but much smaller. And then the next style we've got here is very similar. Ned head, but you've got this wire weed guard. And this time of year, if I'm not fishing this third style of Ned head, this is what I'm fishing. Here in North Carolina, we get a lot of snot grass on the bottom, this green, nasty grass. and it gets on your jig head almost every time. Almost the most weedless bait that I've found, weedless head to fish on that style of grass, are these Ned heads with this little metal weed guard on them. So if you don't have any of these and you want to try Ned rig fishing, I definitely recommend getting this kind for this time of year. It's definitely gonna help you out. Also, you can chunk that up in some oysters, and with the shape of the head, you can kind of wiggle it and get it out. So it makes it very, very weedless. It's more weedless than, you know, a lot of the flies that we're fishing this time of year too, with the little mono. This is kind of a stout wire, which really helps you keep that grass off. And the third type of Ned head that I like to fish, this wouldn't necessarily be called a Ned head, but it's by iStrike, and it's the FINESSE Texas eye, which is a game changer. This is the head that I'm throwing throughout the summer, spring, fall, winter. And the cool thing about this, and I've shown y'all this in some other videos with just the Texas eye jig, is there's a little D-ring that comes off the back of that lead head that this worm hook attaches to. And as you twitch that bait, when you're underwater, I've got underwater video of it, you can actually hear it clicking underwater like a shrimp. And so you've got that little extra added noise that's really subtle, but when it's, you know, on the bottom in the winter, when it's still, the fish can really hear it, they can key in on it. And that shrimp noise, if there's shrimp around this time of year, those fish are wanting to eat them. So fishing this Texas eye gives you that little added advantage. Also, that weedless hook is incredible. And the cool thing is this head's gonna rest and that bait is gonna float up. Now, I don't like fishing this head this time of year with baits that don't float, but 90% of the time I'm fishing a ZMAN bait, which does float. That Elastec is buoyant and it will float in the water. So as it sits on the bottom, that little bait will float up on that jig head. And actually, if you've got a little bit of current, it kind of swings around a little bit and moves. It just adds so much movement. You can pretty much throw it in front of a school, keep your line tight, and not even really do anything, and those fish are going to eat it. As those fish are kicking through, I'm talking redfish in particular, you know, just the movement of their tails is going to have this bait just barely wiggling on the bottom. And I can't tell you how many times I've thrown this jig head, or this Texas eye finesse jig, in the middle of a school or out in front of a school, and as those fish start swimming through it, all of a sudden, boom, one picks it up as I'm just letting it sit there on the bottom. So great way to kind of change the game up a little bit, be a little more weedless. But all these heads work differently, and they all have got slightly different applications. You've kind of got to play around with them and see what works best for you in your water and in your fishery. So I'm going to go and talk a little bit about the baits now. This first bait is incredible bait. Works really good for redfish, but also a great bait for speckled trout in the cold months. It's called a SWIMZ. It's by iStrike. It's just a tiny little paddle tail. And my favorite way to rig this SWIMZ, I really don't rig this bait, and you can see here how tiny of a paddle tail that is. I do not rig this bait on the normal Ned heads usually. I'm almost always rigging it on this Texas eye here, the Texas FINESSE eye, and it just fits on there so perfectly. That little small worm hook fits that bait well. And like I said, colors, you got to just play around and see what works with you or works for you. I'm typically using the same colors that I would use on a larger jig this time of year. I like my natural, more subtle colors, and then I'll have a couple, you know, with a little bit more white in it. But this Slim Swim paired with the Texas eye is a killer in the really cold water. And I'm actually going to do a video just talking about the Slim Swim and the FINESSE Texas eye jig. So be on the lookout for that. The next, this is kind of the traditional Texas, or this is the traditional Ned rig bait. And this is by ZMAN as well. This is the FINESSE TRD. So if you're familiar with bass fishing, like a very generic bass fishing lure called a Cinco worm, this is pretty much the exact same thing, but shrunk down. And most, I'd say 75% of your Ned rig baits made by different companies are gonna have this type of profiles. You know, they'll add little stuff, like this one's got these little nubs on the end of it just to move a little bit more water. You'll see some with ticklers. There's like, ZMAN actually makes one with these couple little legs that kick off one end. But this is about as subtle of a bait as you can throw. The Slim Swim, I would say, is almost right there with it, but this just, it gives the slight essence of a bait fish being there. Like I said, lots of different colors. This is actually a really good one this time of year. Surprisingly, this bait here, it's the White Lightning. It takes the color of the water really well and its surroundings. So it kind of reflects and absorbs those colors that are already in the water, which makes it a pretty subtle finesse bait. So we've got the Slim Swim, we've got the FINESSE TRD. This, if the fish are a little bit less pressured, still cold, still need to finesse those fish, kind of have a finesse presentation, the TRD Bugs is hands down my go-to Ned rig bait. And in the summer, I'll be fishing larger profiles of these same creature baits for redfish on full-size Texas eyes and other hooks. But this is literally just a creature bait like you'd see in bass fishing. A lot of guys have started to fish these in saltwater. If you're not fishing creature baits yet in saltwater, they're great. Little subtle movements of the rod tip, and you've got all these little legs that move around. So that's the great part about this bait, but also its downfall in the really cold months. If it's too cold and the fish are too pressured and not really wanting to eat, sometimes this is a little bit too much movement for those fish, and they'll kind of pull off that bait and not really want to eat it. And so that's my third. And then my fourth, if I'm not fishing Z-Man, I really like Strike King's Ned rig baits. And this is the Rage Ned Bug. And this color here in particular, which is the, I always forget what it's called. It's Dirt. Dirt, it's a simple name. Is a go-to bait for me as well. I've caught a lot of redfish on this time of year. And pretty much all the redfish that I've caught on spinning rod in the past month have been on Ned rigs. Actually, maybe 2 or 3 fish have not been on Ned rigs. So they're great baits. Same deal with this. It's a creature bait, so it's got a lot of movement, which is nice. You can just let it sit there. And this bait does float a little bit. It's not nearly as buoyant as the Z-Man, but sometimes just having that bait kind of arced or kicked to the side or fishing it slowly on the bottom, it just gives you a slightly different presentation. There's no right or wrong way for a Ned head to sit. I mean, they're designed to stand up, but different applications can play, productive in different scenarios. So my biggest suggestion is take what I've shared from this video and apply it in your area, but don't be afraid to change it up. Don't be afraid to try different colors, different shapes, different retrieves. But the beautiful thing about a Ned rig is its size, how small it is, how quietly you can sneak it in front of a school, or even if they're not super spooky or you've got enough water, you can drop it in the school and you can get a real subtle presentation and get those fish to eat that don't normally want to eat. Like I said, be on the lookout for the Slim Swim FINESSE video that I'm going to make as well. That is going to be a game changer for y'all if y'all haven't fished it. Even in deep water, fishing that really light stuff this time of year, it's tough. You've got to slow down fishing these Ned rigs. You've got to slow down, especially if you're not sight fishing. If you're fishing deeper water for trout or deeper water for redfish, it's sometimes tough because it's light. It's really subtle. You've got to fish it extremely slow, but it is so productive. You get 2 or 3 fish on it, it starts to click, the wheels start to turn, and it is a big game changer for cold water fishing, especially on those spooky fish. So I hope this video helped y'all out. Please press that thumbs up button. It helps so much trying to beat YouTube's algorithm and get this YouTube channel out there. I'm going to be making a lot more videos for y'all. I'm actually taking off a couple days each month from my guiding schedule to do on the water fishing videos with y'all. I know y'all like the tackle tips and the podcast, but what y'all ask the most for is more on the water fishing stuff. So stay tuned. We've got some awesome stuff in the works. Thanks again for checking out the video. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one. Later.